I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining us once again, I always look forward to talking with him, is Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff, as you know, is an economist, an economic historian, the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV, and author of a number of books, professor. I could go on, but there's a lot I want to discuss with him, so assuming if you're a regular listener of the show, or more importantly of his, you know who he is. Without any further ado, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the Zero Hour.
Thank you very much, RJ. Looking forward to it.
Me too. Let's give it our best shot. Now, I continue to read the newspaper with my usual mix of bemusement, bewilderment, bafflement, and despair. Okay. And particularly when it comes to economics. And I've been trying to think of a way to kind of crack this nut of why we govern our economic universe in this country and in this world so irrationally. And what occurs to me is back in 2014, as a thought exercise, I wrote a couple pieces which I'm thinking of renovating. I'm not going to ask for your help here on what a people's Federal Reserve would look like. If we had a people's Fed, right now we have a Federal Reserve that is often staffed by people associated with the banking industry, clearly enthralled to the banking industry. In 2014, when I wrote that piece, Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, the largest criminal enterprise in modern American history, was in charge of the compensation committee of the Federal Reserve, meaning he got to decide how much Ben Bernanke made. And but as a thought exercise, I tried, well, what if we had democratic governance when it came to this economy? What if we had a Federal Reserve that looked like the people of this country, was responsive to the needs of the people of this country? How would it be behaving? It seems to me now that exercise is even more relevant than it was then, because we see the Fed, you and I have talked about this numerous times. We see the Fed and the government in partnership, the administration, hand in hand, ignoring many tools they have at their disposal and using interest rates, basically, in a way that victimizes the working people whose real earnings are falling behind anyway. So I guess the thought exercise I would have for you is, what would a democratic people's Federal Reserve and U.S. government be looking at right now to address inflation? We know recent figures were not good. How would a people's economic governance system be reacting right now?
Well, I think it's a wonderful exercise. I wish it was demanded of all of us. I wish that there were real debates about how to best answer your question. But none of that exists. So those of us who are provoked by questions like what you had in that paper you wrote some time ago and what you hopefully will renovate, you force it. And that's good. It's good that we are forced to do it. I come at it in the following kind of broad way. A great deal of what the Federal Reserve does and let's remember, the Federal Reserve is about 100 years old. It was an established institution of the United States government in close cooperation with the banking system, but to bring a kind of order to the monetary system of the United States, which was in great disorder. The whole 19th century of America, you could write the history punctuated by what were called bank panics. And a bank panic, very well chosen word, was when the monetary system went off the rails. Everybody got freaked out that the money literally in their wallets or in their safe deposit boxes wouldn't be worth anything tomorrow or next week. Literally panicked, ran to the bank in hopes of getting their money out before the bank closed its doors, which banks regularly did, telling you, have a nice life, but your money and you have been parted. So we set up this Federal Reserve, a government agency, to bring order and stability. It was told, your job is two things: keep inflations and deflations away from us. These are scary, out of control, damaging experiences. We all don't want them. So price stability, that was the way it was discussed. That's your number one job. And your number two job is to do everything you can to achieve full employment. In other words, let's not have the waste of resources and the waste of people's lives that comes when you don't provide a useful job. It's not good for the person who's without work. It's not good for the community that could and would otherwise benefit from the input of the creativity of an otherwise unemployed person. So, to be honest, we shouldn't even be at this point, because the Federal Reserve has failed at that job just at least as often as it has succeeded. The very fact that we're talking about a serious inflation in the United States right now is ipso facto demonstrating that the Fed didn't prevent it, which is what it was supposed to do. Well, the Fed's approach might then be an object of criticism. And the approach and I like this phrase, so I'm going to use it. The approach of the Federal Reserve has always been trickle down. And that shouldn't surprise anyone, because it's government officials and big bankers. And they think they sit on the top of the social pyramid, so everything they do trickles down, whatever it is they do. And the idea always was they're going to be so adept at controlling two things: the quantity of money in circulation and the interest rate we charge one another to borrow and lend. By manipulating those two tools of monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, this mixture of government official and bank, would manage things in a wonderful way that would get us what we want, namely stable prices and full employment. Now, here's the punchline. They didn't achieve it, which means we have every right to say maybe trickle down isn't the way to go. Maybe giving, for example, when you need to have a boost to your economy, you pump money into the economy. The Federal Reserve literally creates the money and injects it, usually through banks, into the economy. And then the idea is, having printed all this new money, nowadays we do it electronically, so we don't make pieces of paper. When you pump this new money in and you give it to the big banks and the other big players, hopefully, that's all it is. Hopefully, fingers crossed, they will do things so that the money trickles down and eventually in everyone's pocket. And when we all have more money, then we'll go out and spend more. And if we spend more, there'll be jobs for people to produce the more that we're spending on. And the lovely story goes on. Well, it didn't work. It turns out that the people at the top may very well take all the new money and do things with it that preclude trickling down. And so we're all standing there with egg on our face, waiting for the good news to happen, but it didn't, because in effect, the banks and the government are able to deflect in a whole host of ways the so-called trickle down, so it never arrives. Therefore, now to answer your first question, what a People's Federal Reserve might then do is, to avoid this problem, don't increase the quantity of money in circulation by giving it to the top and then hoping it trickles down. If the point is to get it to the people at the bottom, or in the middle, then why don't you give it directly to them? And reason it this way. If we give a lot of new money into the hands of poor people, working people, middle income people, we know from studies of their behavior that they're going to turn around and take most of that new money we give them and spend it for goods and services. And who do they spend it on when they buy goods and services? Why, the corporations who produce those goods and services. In other words, if you give the money to the people at the bottom, get ready now, it'll trickle up. Wow, and it'll end up helping the corporations. And in case you're wondering, gee, what a silly idea, how might that work? Let me assure you, even though the Fed didn't want to do it, even though the government rarely does it, it does actually sometimes happen. So we can point to case studies. And the most recent one is a year old. It is when, in the worst time of the pandemic, the United States government decided to say to every one of the tens of millions of unemployed people, we're going to give you an extra few $100s a week on top of your normal unemployment benefit to help you get through this extraordinary time. And the boost it gave to the economy was virtually instantaneous. There was an example of a program aimed at the quote unquote bottom of the society, unemployed workers, who did exactly what we knew they would do. There's no question whether that money will trickle up. They're not going to sit on that money. They're not people who have any reserves anyway. They have little or no savings. That's why they're in the situation they're in. So they're going to take the money and spend it overwhelmingly, which they did. And the result is corporations sold more, earned more profits, and all the rest. And by extension, then, you could have a Federal Reserve, if it were indeed democratically controlled, that would revisit all of its policies to ask the same question. Maybe we could do better by helping the people we hope our actions eventually reach directly. Why are we going this indirect route that happens to have this peculiar quality? That the money, when it's increased, or anything else that the Federal Reserve does, is first done to satisfy, to please, to incentivize the people that are already the richest, most powerful people in the society. If you think that's an accident, well, then I got a bridge to sell you, right? It isn't. They want it that way. They want to have the money come to them first. They want to exercise veto power over what ends up happening, because that's how they control this system. And that's the real issue behind this. But there is nothing in economics, nothing, that gives you a reason a priori at the beginning to think that the only way the Federal Reserve can affect the monetary system is by dealing with people at the top. And by the way, that includes what's going on now with raising the interest rates. Okay, you're going to raise the interest rates. One of the major ways the government does that, by the way, people should understand, is by manipulating the market in Treasury and other kinds of securities. The Federal Reserve buys and sells them. And when it buys those securities, that's a way of pumping money into the economy, because you're taking the securities away from people and giving them cash money. And by the same token, if it's an inflation, the way we have now, you do the opposite. You sell the securities, typically that you bought earlier, because when you sell them into the public sphere, money has to be paid by whoever in the private sector buys the security from the Federal Reserve, and it takes that money and pulls it out of the economy. Okay, notice the way that the interest rates are manipulated is in dealings between the Federal Reserve and whoever is the buyer or the seller of Treasury securities. And most of the people watching this program, like you and me, RJ, are not in that business. We've never had a meeting in a fancy office in downtown New York or elsewhere to discuss the prices at which the Fed will buy our securities or sell us security. That's a very cozy arrangement, among a very small group of people who, by the way, know each other personally because they're making these deals literally every week, and they make them to satisfy themselves. The government has to give an incentive if people who own securities are going to sell them to the Federal Reserve. They have to give them an incentive if the public is to buy the securities from the Federal Reserve. So whether they're increasing or decreasing the quantity of money, again, the veto power, the control, the middleman, if you like, in all these dealings are the richest, most powerful players in the financial economy. You cannot then be surprised that the particular policies they pursue tend to give them the lion's share of the reward and all of the risk of that trickling down never happening and all the rest go to the rest of the population, like everything else in this system. But it doesn't have to be that way. You know, give you an idea now, they're raising the interest rates. Why are they raising interest rates on everybody? Why aren't they discriminating? Maybe interest rates should be raised on people with a higher income, people in this market or that market. In other words, all kinds of changes could be made that make the impact of whatever the Fed does different from what it has been. The Fed has kept our capitalist system going. That's what it was invented to do, that's what its job has been, and that's what it has done. And many of the failures are because it is beholden to acting in that particular way, and that's why we live in this bizarre moment. You know, I've been saying this on interview shows for weeks now. This bizarre moment when the United States, trying to cope with an inflation that this out-of-control economy has imposed on all of us, here is the government trying to deal with it, acting as though having the Federal Reserve raise interest rates is the only game in town. This requires a stupefying amnesia. Nixon in 1971 stopped an inflation with a wage price freeze. That's an alternative policy. That's not raising interest rates. That's doing something else. Roosevelt in the 40s pushed the entire market out of the window to avoid an inflation and substituted rationing in this country that lasted for years. You know, the point is, why in the world, having had a Democratic president do rationing to avoid an inflation, having had a Republican conservative president do wage price freeze to cope with and reduce an inflation, why we should now be acting as though there were nothing other that we could do, that's a little bit like, and I hope I don't upset anyone here, but it's a little bit like saying the only thing that could be happening in Ukraine right now is a war. Wait a minute. What are you talking about? Wars are avoided by negotiations. Wars are brought to an end by negotiation. Why are we not having a national discussion? Why are we listening to endless statements about how awful the Russians are, how awful Mr. Putin is, as if we haven't negotiated with all kinds of awful leaders when we were trying to stop a war or to prevent a war? It is so bizarre that you really have to begin to wonder what it is that's being hidden here. What are the other motives? Because the facade is not believable.
And, you know, there are multiple things, and I do want to actually get back to Ukraine in a sense, but diplomacy, after all, is for talking to people who are not your friends, including your enemies. That's who you talk to. That's what it's for. But it seems to me that we are told that the economy operates by certain rules, but when the dominant system is threatened, all of a sudden the Fed and other institutions find it extraordinary abundances, reserves, no pun intended, of creativity. We were told for years the Federal Reserve only deals with banks. But during the 2008 financial crisis, which, by the way, shouldn't have happened if they were doing their job supervising the banks, when the 2008 financial crisis happened, all of a sudden they retroactively declared Goldman Sachs, whomever else, General GE Capital, I can't remember, but they declared non-banks to be banks so they could rescue them. So that was pretty creative for people who say they have no flexibility. After the pandemic struck, they directly reached out to corporations and provided financial backstops to corporations, including mismanaged, murderous corporations like Boeing, killing thousands of people through its own criminal neglect. Nevertheless, able to survive and thrive. No conditions put on this by the Fed. No change your incompetent management. No stop killing people even. So there's obviously a lot bigger toolkit when the right people are in trouble, right? So I guess that's point number one. And point number two, it also strikes me that there's a kind of, I don't know how to describe it, and almost like one of those people, the two lobes of their brain are separated and can't work together. It's like we've deliberately imposed that on ourselves, that we can't play the entire keyboard. When we're looking at the economy, we have to exclude the Fed's over here, the government's over here. But for example, if the government decides to impose sanctions on Russia, we could debate whether sanctions are a weapon of war, whether they're right, whether they're wrong. But the fact is, if you impose sanctions on Russia in a war with Ukraine that you didn't act to stop, then, 20-30% of the world's grain supply is cut off, a significant portion of the energy supply is cut off. That's going to affect the economy, right? You don't have to have such a surprised look on your face 3 or 4 months later when it affects the economy. Anybody who pays any attention, I'm sorry I'm ranting, but anybody who pays any attention to this stuff could say, yes, that was going to happen. But yet you look surprised and then you say, well, I guess the only thing we can do is raise rates. It seems to me that there's not only doesn't the left hand know what the right hand is doing, the individual fingers are not in communication. And it seems to me that a sort of democratically run economy would be considering all this and acting in concert, and not like getting caught flat-footed and then deciding, well, we better make it tough for people to buy stuff, people whose wages are already falling back. Am I oversimplifying things?
No, and I think I like the way you connected it to the issues around Ukraine, because it really is similar. And when you look at them together, this last week, and I think I can show you that I'm not going too far afield here, but this last week, when the United States and Russia had no communication that we know of, other than what might have been secret, there were publicly acknowledged telephone calls between Mr. Putin on the one hand and the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, and between Mr. Putin on the one hand and the chancellor in Germany, Mr. Scholz. France and Germany are the two most powerful economies in Europe. So for that conversation to happen, that's a conversation between the Russian side in the Ukraine war and the European commitment, which is very strong and widespread, to support the sanctions that were led by, designed by, and imposed by the United States. All over Europe, the following joke, and it isn't all that funny, is made. The Americans in the Ukraine war are committed to fighting to the last Ukrainian.
Right.
And the second part of that joke is, and they're willing to fund the war to the last euro that the Europeans can get together. Why? Because when you sanctioned Russia, you opened the possibility that Russia would react with sanctions of its own, which it did. And the major one, not the only one, but the major one was to cut off oil and gas supplies to Europe. The United States doesn't get significant oil and gas from Russia, never did, doesn't now. Therefore, it's not vulnerable. Russia hit back at who was vulnerable. The inflations, therefore, in Europe are worse than they are here, scheduled to get more worse as this year goes on. Leaders in Europe are talking about freezing this winter and all the rest of it. The Europeans have committed 500 billion euros. That's roughly the same as $500 billion at the current exchange rate, because the euro has lost so much value, because the Europeans are in such trouble. Did people think Mr. Putin would just roll over? Did they think the Russians would just cave? Did the European politicians at all rushed in to show how they were on the side of the little Ukraine against the monster Russia? Did those politicians not understand that their people would now hold them responsible? Well, they didn't, which tells you something about the quality of European leadership. But they're figuring it out now as cities become full of demonstrators who don't want to give up their standards of living for a Ukraine they can barely find on the map. I'm not arguing right or wrong here, but there is a failure to understand and meanwhile to act desperately. It's interpreted around the world, and not just in Russia and China, as an empire going down, discovering that it can't do what it used to do. It doesn't have the power, and it doesn't recognize it so as to work diplomatically and work out a new arrangement. It's as if the British never got the message after the Revolutionary War of 1776 or the War of 1812 that they weren't going to recapture the United States and reconvert it back into colonial status, so they better come to an agreement of how the rest of the 19th century was going to work. That's how they had to learn the lesson. Be a shame if what we're seeing is the flailing around domestically by a Fed that can't do what it's supposed to do, keeps grabbing at new things, whose only common thread is that the rich get richer, and we'll see whether it works or not. This is the behavior not of a calm, I'm in charge economic system. This is the behavior both of a system and an empire that is in deep decline and denying it every step of the way.
Which I would, certainly, and I doubt you'll disagree, I would say also applies to the United States. The conflict in Ukraine, again, not taking sides there, but the conflict in Ukraine was presented as a kind of something we could support militarily, virtuously, and pain-free. And at no point did a People's Fed or anybody else say to the American people, well, you don't have to support negotiation, which, by the way, was what Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, wanted initially. You can go along with your government in blocking, or to the British people, you can go along with Prime Minister Boris Johnson in telling Zelensky he can't negotiate. You can do that if you want, but it's going to cost you. Yeah. Now, it's going to cost you economically and in other ways. Now, Britishers are paying, £4,000 and more for their energy costs. Now, Americans are feeling the brunt, although nobody's necessarily putting two and two together for them. We're not being kept informed. We're not making informed decisions. We're not balancing our own sacrifice because the pain against the virtues of something like negotiation, because the pain is being kept away from the top, I would argue, and not being communicated to the rest of us. Yeah,
and I think you're watching very careful in the mainstream media, attributing the pain here of an inflation that has gotten worse and is lingering on, and who knows whether and when it'll stop. You link it to Putin. In other words, you link it to the bad guy who made it happen. You yourself are we in America are pure spectators. I mean, no one in their right mind believes. The United States has been busy for the last century intervening everywhere.
Right.
I'm proud of it. Suddenly, here comes a momentous event. We are nothing doing it. We are complete passive victims of. And you know why? Because they dare not do what you just did. They dare not say the war in Ukraine, therefore the continuation of the war in Ukraine, and the fact that there's nothing happening in the United States to indicate a desire for this to stop, for negotiations, which is normally how you end a war, to take place. None of it. They don't want this to begin to be understood. Because if the American people, I'm not confident of much, but what I'm about to say, I'm confident of. If the American people understood that the savaging of their standard of living, which this inflation is doing, and which the rising interest rates threaten to make worse, because they threaten to have a recession without any guarantee that the prices will come down. And why do I know that? Because we've already had that half a dozen times in the last 50 years. We even have a word for that. It's called stagflation. When the economy stagnates, which is bad, and at the same time, you have an inflation, which makes it worse. No one, as I think I told you, Janet Yellen and I were classmates at Yale. At the same time, we had the same teachers, the same books, the same exams, everything. I know exactly what she learned. Same thing I learned. She's not doing what she learned. She's doing other stuff that the people at the top, her team, believe they have to do now. I understand that. But it's far from what we were told. We were told stagflation is a problem. But you don't hear Mrs. Yellen telling us today, ooh, stagflation is a problem. We might then we at the Fed will have made the inflation worse by adding a recession to it, which nobody in their right mind wants. None of that is explained. None. People like us, called upon by those media that dare, we can try to explain it. But you know what I'm explaining? I'm explaining what Janet Yellen learned right next to me at the same time. The little bit we know from the history of what has been done. Hiding this from the American people, again, makes you really have to wonder, why does this get hidden? Why this crazy focus on interest rates as if there were nothing else we could do? Why this crazy argument that if interest rates go up and we slow the economy down, we're going to have a nice soft landing of our inflation rather than the horror of stagflation? And at a time when the country is falling apart internally with bitter, divisive disputes, do you really want to take that risk of making... You think that Trump versus Biden, or however you understand this, is bad now. You superimpose a period of depression on top of inflation, and all bets are off as to how this is going to spiral out.
Social disorder plus economic chaos is the worst of all. I mean, economic chaos where people know what's going on is bad enough. But when people aren't told what's going on, that's a recipe for the kind of anarchy we're beginning to see now, isn't it?
And will we be surprised if there really is a further downturn, that the conservative Republicans will tell a story of who the evil conspiracies were that made our otherwise wonderful economy, which Mr. Biden told us was a wonderful economy, go off the rail? You haven't prepared anyone for anything. It's a little bit like in the Soviet Union. You didn't explain that you had interpreted socialism in a particular way, that socialism could be quite different. So when the particular socialism you presided over didn't work out real well, people thought their only option was to go back to capitalism because you had set it up. You never gave them the chance to debate and explore alternatives, which were there, about how a socialist society could develop. In the end, You help do yourself in.
Well, I was hoping we could end on a more positive note with this topic, but I guess the positive note is that there are people like you in this society out there trying to explain not only the mechanics, but the morality of our economic system as it is, and even more importantly, as it could be. So I thank you for that, Richard Wolff, and as always, I thank you for coming on the program.
My pleasure, RJ. And these are the kinds of conversations, all I can say is that we have to have everywhere, all over this society, if we're going to have a chance to find a better way out than what we're stuck with now.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. And we'll be right back. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.